Thanks, Gordon. Yeah, I'm going to talk to you all about American democracy. So we're a little more parochial, smaller, but America's a pretty big country. And I want us to think about ways in which we might help the disadvantaged in American democracy and ways in which we can make American democracy maybe slightly more equitable. I'm going to do that by introducing you to Bo and Deshaun, two middle-aged men. I actually don't know Bo or Deshaun at all, never met either one of them. But I do know a fair amount about them and about their political views. So Bo and Deshaun are similar in a lot of different ways. So they're getting into retirement age. They're both single. They're both very much working class. So neither Bo nor Deshaun has graduated from college. And both of them are sort of struggling to get by, minimum wage, poverty levels, essentially. Both are also from the South and from the state of Georgia in particular. So lots of similarities. They're different in one aspect, or at least one key aspect, and that is race. Bo is white, as his made-up name is meant to suggest, and Deshaun is African American, as his assigned name is also meant to suggest for him as well. Why do I highlight that difference? I'm going to show that race is the single most important demographic factor shaping American democracy. So race is critically important when we determine who we vote for. Race, and even more, I'd say important, race is the most important determinant of who wins and who loses in American democracy. So whether you're on the winning side or losing side of the vote, whether you're on the winning side or losing side of policy. Now, I am going to show you that American democracy is racially uneven, but I don't want to be totally negative. So I'm going to sort of think about moving forward and think about different ways in which we can make American democracy more equitable. But I'm not going to give that away yet, so you gotta keep listening. Let's start with division first. So despite that America is now a nation of inequality, we're facing sort of some of the highest levels of income inequality that we have ever experienced. Despite that, I'm going to sort of suggest that race is the most, race more than class is what divides us. So if we take Bo and Deshaun, despite the fact that both are poor, they have sort of almost diametrically opposed political preferences. So Bo, the white man, is fairly conservative. So he opposes gun control. He opposes Obamacare. He favors the death penalty. When he votes, he always votes Republican. By contrast, Deshaun, the African-American male, is largely liberal. He favors gun control. He really wants to raise the minimum wage. He'd like Obamacare to be expanded. He votes Democrat every time he votes as well. So that's division, sort of suggesting that despite the fact that they're similar by class, they differ greatly in terms of their preferences. Now let's think about outcomes, who wins and who loses. So again, despite the fact that they have strikingly similar economic circumstances, Bo and Deshaun end up, by most available measures, on opposite ends of American democracy. Bo, the white man, generally wins. Deshaun, the African-American, generally loses. So when Bo was asked in a 2016 survey who he voted for in the presidential election, he said, of course, Trump, and we all know that Trump won. Bo was asked about a series of other elections, statewide and federal. In every single case, the candidate that he voted for ended up winning the election. Bo was winning not just on sort of in terms of outcomes in the vote, but also on policy. So Georgia has one of the highest uninsured rates in the nation. Bo supports that, or at least he doesn't mind that at all. Georgia has some of the lowest or the most lax gun control laws in the nation. Bo supports that as well. Georgia uses the death penalty. Bo is quite happy with that. And by contrast, Deshaun is generally a loser in American democracy. So most of the policies that he wants enacted tend not to come to fruition. So he wants the minimum wage to be increased in Georgia. Georgia's minimum wage of $5.15 is tied for the lowest in the country. He wants strict gun control laws. Again, Georgia has some of the most lax gun control laws. Almost anybody can own any kind of gun they want in Georgia. He wants Obamacare to be expanded in a state where Obamacare is essentially shunned. So again, the pattern is the white man's generally winning, the African-American male is generally losing. Now, these are two individuals, perhaps a nice anecdote, but is it really true that more broadly, race is a factor that helps determine, or maybe the most important factor that helps determine who wins and who loses in American democracy? So to answer that sort of broader question, I looked at a range of surveys. So in fact, over the last half century, about 500,000 Americans have been asked their preferences on policy. And then I've looked to see whether those preferences were enacted, and in particular, whose preferences were enacted and whose views were ignored. So more specifically, the General Social Survey over the last 4 decades has asked about 500,000 Americans whether they want increases or decreases in different aspects of federal government spending. So now we're looking at the national government, and in the survey, individual Americans are asked, should we increase or decrease spending on on exactly 11 different policy areas, things like military spending, welfare spending, transportation. The 11 areas don't cover all aspects of spending, but they cover the majority of the budget. So I went, compiled all that data, and then looked to see whether the federal government actually spent money in the ways that people wanted it to spend money. So if I, as an individual, said in a certain year that I would like welfare spending to be increased, I then looked to see whether in the next year the federal government actually spent more money on welfare or not. So did it listen to me or did it ignore me? You then do that for all 500,000 people across the 11 policy areas, across the 4 decades of data. When you do that, you find a few things. Number one, and probably most encouragingly, it appears that American democracy is pretty responsive. So a lot of the time, government did what most of the American population wanted it to do. Secondly, for most of the groups, demographic groups I looked at, there weren't big differences in terms of who wins and who loses. So men versus women, young versus old, there weren't big differences. But as you can see here, behind me, there is one variable that sort of sticks out, and that's race at the very top, right? So what you see is that blacks are losing relative to whites significantly more than any other group is losing to its sort of comparison group. And so here, the gap's not massive. Controlling for all these demographic factors, controlling for some other factors that aren't in the figure, I find that blacks are likely to lose on policy 5% more of the time than whites. And importantly, that black-white gap that you see at the top is far larger than the gap by gender. It's far larger than the gaps by class. It's even larger than the gaps by party or ideology. Now, we can look at all that and say, maybe that isn't so bad. In a democracy, there's going to be winners and losers, absolutely. And we can also say whites are a majority in this nation. Blacks are a minority, and therefore, why wouldn't we expect whites to have more of a say? All that, I think, is reasonable to argue. What I will say is this becomes a bit more of a problem if the group that's losing is consistently losing time and time again. And when I dug in deeper into the data, that's essentially what you find. So African Americans are losing consistently in the vote more than whites. They're losing consistently on policy issue after policy issue in year after year. So if you're Deshaun, you're already struggling. You're trying to get by, and you're finding that government is doing essentially the opposite of what you want, time after time, policy after policy. It's obviously going to be discouraging, eroding your sense of belonging, may lead to resentment, and potentially even aggression. The other thing that might make this pattern be something that we really care about is whether we can explain it, right? So can we explain why blacks are losing more? And I can explain it. So the figure that you see here is essentially looking at the racial gap and these other gaps after controlling for all the things that we think might matter in terms of winning and losing in American democracy. So blacks are not losing more than whites because they tend to be disproportionately poor, disproportionately less well-educated. And also, strikingly, this incorporates your partisanship, your ideology, and whether you want a spending increase or decrease. So blacks are not losing more than whites because they're overwhelmingly liberal, largely Democratic. In fact, when I do further analysis, I find that even when blacks have exactly the same policy preferences at the same time as whites, their preferences are weighed less heavily than white preferences are. So what this is telling us essentially is that blacks are consistently losing more than whites, and there does appear to be some discrimination in that process. And that is probably something that we should care about. Now, that's all negative so far. I want to sort of think about, is there anything we can do to make American democracy more equitable? Recall that I said that blacks lose most of the time in most years, right? And that's true, but there are some years when, relative to whites, blacks are not losing that much, and there are even some extraordinary years when blacks win on policy just as much as whites. So my next task was essentially to say, okay, what explains that variation over time? And what I found was that which political party controls the lever of power is the single most important determinant of whether American democracy is sort of racially balanced or whether there are imbalances or inequities. So when Republicans control the presidency in Congress, there is a fairly large, about an 8-point, 8.5-point racial gap in policy responsiveness. By contrast, when Democrats control both the presidency and Congress, that racial imbalance effectively goes away, and American government responds relatively equally to each racial and ethnic group. So if we care about Deshaun and we want him to feel as a full member of American democracy, if we care about both Deshaun and Beau and we want them each to have an equal opportunity, and if we care about American democracy and want it to be as fair as it can be, there is, in some sense, a pathway forward. And I'll stop there. Thank you.